Hello everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories, where today we are continuing our reading of Silas K. Hawking's Real Grit. We are now at chapter 12, and as a quick recap of what's happened so far, I will tell you that the hero of this tale, Jack Formby, and the woman with whom he is in love, Ada Woodville, have experienced some recent turmoil. Jack's father died suddenly, and he was cast out of his family home, his father having perished due to a fatal heart attack, it appears, at learning that his fortune had been destroyed by Providence, a failure of his investments to even make the money that he spent back. And so Jack has found himself destitute, but not hopeless. He believes that he will rise to the challenge that life has given him and come away a more full-hearted and inspired individual, which Ada hopes for too, for she loves him but cannot condone his idleness, his sloth, and his lack of passion for anything in life. And so once, it seems, he has proved himself, then the two can be united in love and in a shared sense of belonging in the world. So Jack has found employment at a business in Bodelford called Brown Toadsby's, and we were introduced to both Mr. Brown and Mr. Toadsby last time. Some rather odious fellows who Jack has come to know through his cousin, Ralph Formby, who's a bit of a charmer and a great philanthropist. It appears that he also has his eyes on Miss Woodville's heart, or at least her inheritance, as these things often go. So, with that background given, we will continue our story with Chapter 12, Blighted Hopes. Jack had been at Brown Toadsby's nearly 3 months, and was flattering himself that he was getting to be a thorough man of business, when an event transpired that shattered all his hopes and plunged him into the depths of despair. He was sitting before his desk as usual, engaged in adding up several long columns of figures, when Mr. Toadsby suddenly pushed open the door of his private office and called in his sharp, grating voice, "Mr. Formby, will you come this way, please?" "Yes, sir," Jack answered, and instantly rose from his chair and followed the retreating figure of Mr. Toadsby. "Kindly close the door behind you," said Mr. Toadsby, as soon as Jack had stepped over the threshold of the private office. "There, that will do. Now take a seat, as I have something of importance to say to you." Jack instantly complied, much wondering what was in the wind, and half hoping that the junior partner was about to propose a raise in his salary. For several minutes Mr. Toadsby occupied himself in carefully turning over several loose sheets of paper, but whether they were letters or receipts Jack could not see. At length, without looking up, he said, "You informed me on Monday, Mr. Formby, that Mr. Jonas Wilkins had not paid his account. Is that so?" "Yes, sir, quite right," Jack answered. "Has he paid his account yet?" "Not to me, sir." "Not to you?" "No, sir." "Would you kindly explain the meaning of this receipt, Mr. Formby?" "Where did you get that from?" Jack asked with a gasp, and turning pale to the very lips. "The signature is yours, I presume," said Mr. Toadsby with a smile. "Yes, it looks like mine, certainly," said Jack, looking all completely bewildered, "but I do not understand it at all." "Will you kindly fetch your receipt book? Most likely you will have the counterfoil of this." Jack instantly rushed back to his own desk, and in a few seconds returned with the receipt book, which he handed to Mr. Toadsby. "The number of the receipt, I see," said Mr. Toadsby, as if speaking to himself, "is 5684. The counterfoil of this is missing, as I expected. As clumsy a bit of swindling as I ever met with, this. The thief is evidently new to the business." "I do not understand you," said Jack, flushing crimson. "Do you insinuate that I... He could not put the thought into words. It was too horrible. But he stood, glaring at Mr. Toadsby like a caged tiger. "Please, calm yourself," said Mr. Toadsby blandly. "Evidently there is something that wants clearing up here. Now, let me explain my part in the affair. Then, perhaps, you will be good enough to explain yours. You informed me on Monday that Mr. Jonas Wilkins had not paid his account. That is so, I believe?" "Yes, sir." "Very good. I took the liberty of calling on Mr. Jonas Wilkins myself this morning, in order to press for payment. And on mentioning the object of my visit, he manifested great surprise and indignation, which ended by producing this receipt for the amount, which, on my giving him a written guarantee, he allowed to come into my possession. The receipt is from your book, and bears your signature, while the £42 10 have not come into our hands. Perhaps, now, Mr. Formby, you will be good enough to explain your share in the transaction." "I tell you, Mr. Toadsby," said Jack, clenching his fists, "I have had nothing to do with the transaction, and so I have nothing to explain." "That is all bravado," said Mr. Toadsby, with a sneer. "You had better make a clean breast of it at once. It will be better for you in the end." "Make a clean breast of it?" said Jack, hissing out the words between his clenched teeth. "Confess myself a rogue? Never, sir. I tell you there is some devilish bit of villainy at the bottom of this." "Evidently there is," said Mr. Toadsby blandly, "and according to present appearances, you, sir, are the villain." "Me, sir? Me?" hissed Jack, white with rage, and taking a long stride in Mr. Toadsby's direction. "Say that again, and your toothless mouth shall not utter another lie for the next 6 months." and Jack shook his fist so near Mr. Toadsby's face that the latter nearly fell back over his chair. "You had better behave, sir," gasped Toadsby at length. "I do not wish to hand you over to the police, but I shall be compelled to do so if you carry on in this way. For your father's sake, and for the sake of the honourable name you bear, I do not wish to prosecute, but if you drive me to extremes, I will show no mercy." "Mercy, you toothless scoundrel!" roared Jack. "It is not mercy that I want, but justice. You know that in spite of that receipt which I cannot explain, but which most likely you can, you know, I say, that in spite of the receipt I am honest. Do you think, even if I wanted to be a rogue, that I should be such a contemptible fool as to adopt a measure like that? A son of Robert Formby playing the villain and the fool for a paltry £40. How dare you, sir, charge me with such a thing? I tell you, sir, my good name is worth more to me than all the wealth of Bodelford would be. All my hopes of this life and the life to come are wrapped up in it. And do you think I should be such a despicable idiot as to fling it away in this fashion? Don't talk to me about mercy, sir. I want right and justice." "That is what I want," said Mr. Toadsby mildly. "Here are certain facts, Mr. Formby, and facts are stubborn things. Mr. Wilkins pays an account of £40 odd, which we do not receive. He holds a receipt for the same with your signature. That receipt is taken from your book, the counterfoil of which is missing. Put yourself in my place and ask what is the conclusion to which you would come." "I admit," said Jack, "that, put in that bald way, the case looks bad against me. But this is a case in which a man should exercise his judgment and common sense. And I ask, is it likely that I should be guilty of folly so great?" "No, sir, it is not likely," said Mr. Toadsby. "That is, no one would have suspected you. But here are these facts, and they have to be explained in some way. How am I to explain them?" "I don't know," said Jack, slowly. "There's some piece of villainy at the bottom of this, somewhere." "You admit that somebody is dishonest, then?" "I'm sure of it," said Jack. "Then who am I to suspect?" said Mr. Toadsby. "All our other clerks are old servants who have been with us many years and whose characters are above suspicion. Am I to charge them, either of them or all of them, with dishonesty? Moreover, no shadow of suspicion rests upon either of them. On the contrary, all the suspicions point in another direction, and it were manifestly an unjust and a cruel thing even to suspect them, much less to charge them with dishonesty." "And it is no less an unjust and cruel thing to suspect me," said Jack, who felt that he was getting worsted in the argument. "This is mere bandying words, Mr. Formby," Mr. Toadsby replied in a tone of irritation. "Every suspicion points to you. You must admit that. To you, therefore, I come for an explanation, and I give you until tomorrow to get out of the difficulty. As I said before, for your father's sake, and I may also add for your cousin's sake, we do not intend to prosecute, but unless you can clear up the mystery by tomorrow, You must seek situation somewhere else. To this, Jack made no reply. For a moment he stood with bent head and downcast eyes, as if undecided what to do, then suddenly turned on his heel and walked out of the office. His first thought was to call on his cousin Ralph, but he thought better of it, and went instead to the office of Mr. Wilkins. "Not at home, sir," was the answer he got to his inquiry. "But he was at home this morning," said Jack. "Yes, that is quite true," was the answer, "but he left about an hour ago for Paris, and will not be back for a fortnight." Jack heard the words in silence. He felt as though everything was against him, as though heaven had no ear for his prayers, and earth no room for such as he. With a sigh he retraced his steps out into the sunshiny street. On every side people jostled him as they hurried to and fro, but he saw nothing, heard nothing. He walked on like one in a dream, neither knowing the direction he took or caring. He had a vague feeling in his heart that he had been cruelly wronged, that wicked people had deliberately plotted to ruin him. Yet who these people were he had not the remotest idea. As far as he could tell, he had not an enemy in the world. No one could possibly gain anything by his ruin, and what motive anyone could have in trying to compass his destruction was to him a mystery. Who could have got hold of his receipt book? That somebody had was clear, for the counterfoil had been torn out. And then there was his signature on the receipt. That was more perplexing still, for he felt certain that he had never put his name on a blank receipt since he had been at Brown Toadsby's. What was the inference? Someone in the office had a key that would unlock his drawer, had used that key, had abstracted the receipt, and had forged his name. But who? In fact, he suspected no one. As Mr. Toadsby had said, they were all old and trusted servants, and in his heart he could not believe that any one of them would do such a wicked and dastardly thing. Absolutely, then, he had no defence. Such an explanation as he had to offer would be laughed at in any court of law. He felt that he was powerless. The plot to accomplish his ruin had been so skilfully laid that not only could he not unravel it, he could not even guess who had laid the snare. He must bear the brand of infamy in silence, as far as he could see. He must go out into the world with a blot on his fair name, and never be able to lift up his head again. "Oh, this is a cruel fate," he moaned. "I could have borne poverty or want, but to be robbed of my character is to lose my all. Oh, that I had never been born." The next moment, a gentle hand was laid upon his arm, and looking up with a start, he encountered the fair face and sweet liquid eyes of Ada Woodville. "Oh, Mr. Formby," she said, "you must excuse me, but I could not help coming across the street to speak to you. It seems years since I last saw you." "Yes," he said, almost brokenly. "It seems a long time. But it will be much longer ere we meet again. Indeed, I fear this will be our last meeting on earth." "Why, Mr. Formby, what can you mean?" she said in a tone of alarm. "And why do you look so dejected? You do not seem pleased to see me at all. Has anything happened that is likely to destroy our friendship? Yes, everything has happened, he answered slowly. So much has happened that when you hear of it, you will loathe my name and try to forget that you ever knew me. No, no, she answered quickly. I'm sure you're mistaken in that. I shall always think of you as one of the dearest friends I have ever had, and I shall be proud of you as long as I live for the manly way in which you've taken up the burden of your changed lot, and the noble, patient manner you have settled down to a life of toil and poverty. Oh, Miss Ada, he said, with tears in his eyes, it is just like you to talk in that kind and hopeful way, but you don't know all. Would to God we had died together in Boggart Clough. Oh, please, don't talk that way, Mr. Formby, she said pleadingly. It isn't like you at all. And I thought, when I came across the street to speak, you would be very pleased to see me again. Pleased to see you again, he answered, brushing his hand across his eyes. God knows that for the last 3 months I have been hungering with an unutterable hunger for a sight of your face. Oh, you do not know, Miss Ada, and no words can express it, how I have longed for one of your smiles, and to hear, if only for a moment, the music of your voice. But for thinking of you, I should have fainted under the weary burden of my daily life. And I have not been without hope either that I should win the battle I had set myself to fight, for God knows I have tried hard, and have worked early and late that I might please my employers and fit myself for something better in the future, if ever the chance should offer. But all that is ended now. If we had met yesterday, I should have been the happiest man on earth. But today your presence seems but to intensify my misery and deepen my despair. For a moment she looked at him, as if utterly bewildered. Then in low, sad tones she said, So you wish me to leave you, and are sorry that I have spoken. Be it so then, Mr. Formby, and I am sorry if I have offended you. No, no, he said pleadingly, don't leave me in anger, and if you can spare me a few minutes longer, I will explain all. Are you here alone? Oh, quite alone, she answered. Kate was prevented from coming at the last moment. Then let us go into the park, he said, for I see we are close to the gates, and we can talk there unmolested. To this proposition she readily assented, and a few minutes later they were seated, side by side, on one of the park seats, engaged in earnest conversation. Chapter 13. Hopes and Fears. There were very few people in the park. Down by the lake some children were laughing and playing, and here and there a solitary nursemaid might be seen wheeling a perambulator, or deep in the mysteries of some penny dreadful was seated on one of the chairs. Jack led the way to a seat nicely shaded by a broad-leaved sycamore, but remained standing for several minutes after Ada had sat down. It was a glorious July day, warm and even oppressive in the city, but here in the open park there was just breeze enough to keep the air from becoming stagnant. In the shadow of the trees it was simply delicious, and made one feel that it was just a joy to live. Jack, however, was too oppressed and care-ridden to notice the sunshine or see the flowers. In the tree clumps the birds were singing right merrily, but he did not hear them, nor did he heed the laughter of the children floating up from the lakeside. For a moment he almost forgot the presence of Ada, as the events of the morning rushed through his memory like the recollection of a horrible dream. At length he drew himself up like one who had nearly fallen asleep, then sat quietly down by the side of his companion. Ada quietly waited for him to speak, though she was in no hurry for him to begin. She was thinking again of their last meeting, and felt, even now, his warm kiss upon her lips. How much had happened since then, and what a change had come over her lover. Lover? He seemed no longer that. He was as though that last meeting had never been, or else as though a great gulf had come between them, which no earthly power or skill could bridge. If he had presumed a little in memory of their last meeting, she would not have been surprised, or even displeased. But neither by word or look or tone did he allude to that day. Perhaps he had given her up, had relinquished the hope he once had cherished, and she heaved a little sigh at the thought. For he was dearer to her today in this trouble and despondency than ever he had been before. He spoke at length in his usual abrupt fashion. "I have something to tell you, Miss Ada, and when I have told my story we must go our ways, and God knows if we'll ever see each other again." She made no reply to this little introduction, and then he went on, as if there had been no pause, to speak of what had transpired that morning. "You will see," he said in conclusion, "that my reputation has been taken from me, and that was my only possession. Practically I have no defence. Whoever the rogue is, he has managed the matter so cleverly that every particle of suspicion falls on me. I'm afraid that even my best friends, when they hear of it, will pronounce me guilty, for I have nothing to offer against the charge but my simple denial. And that, I fear, in these suspicious times, will count for little." Ada felt so too, but she did not say so. She resolved it could not encourage him, at least, and she would not help to depress him. "What I am to do," he went on, "God only knows. I've tried to do my best, but I might have done my worst for the good that's come of it." "No, no," Ada answered quickly. "You have had the satisfaction of knowing that you have done right, and a good conscience is surely worth something." "You believe, then, that without doubt or demur that my hands are clean?" he said excitedly. "Oh, I do, Mr. Thornby," she answered, looking him frankly in the face. "I believe you are incapable of a mean or dishonest action." "Oh, God bless you for those words," he said reverently and with the sound of tears in his voice. "I can bear a great deal with the knowledge that you still believe in me." "You will not fail," she said. "I am sure you will not, and this trial will but help to make you strong." "I hope your words may come true," he said despairingly, "but the world is very dark just now. For 3 months I have been trying to do my best. I've lived within my little income, small as it is, and I've done no single thing that even my mother would regret. if she were living. And it does seem very hard, when one has lived purely and done his duty, to be accused of theft. Oh, it is very hard, she said, but depend upon it, all will come right in the end. I do not know, he said with downcast eyes. Better men than I am have been crushed by the weight of unkindly circumstances, and have given up in despair. Men may fight when they have something to lose, but when all is gone, they lose heart and just drift with the tide. How it may be with me, I do not know. I am tenacious of life and honour, and shall hold fast as long as I can. May I ask you to pray for me, and if the worst comes to the worst, think kindly of me to the last? You must not talk of the worst, she said. You will not fail if you trust in God. I shall hear you shouting victory yet. Oh, I wish I had your faith, he said with a smile. Anyhow, your words will always be a comfort to me. Oh, and now we must say goodbye again. I have detained you too long already. Whether ever we may meet again, God only knows. But we may be friends still, though we meet no more. And he turned away his head to hide the moisture that had gathered in his eyes. We may be friends as long as you will, she said brokenly, and she placed her little trembling hand in his. We will part here, he said, and I will go out by the other gate. Here in the sunshine, as once we parted before. He felt her hand tremble in his as though it would be withdrawn as he spoke these words, while a hot blush swiftly mounted to her cheeks. No, no, he said quickly, you mistake me. I know what is due from me in my changed circumstances. I will not presume on what has been, or on what might have been. He dropped her hand suddenly, as though something had stung him. His last goodbye she scarcely heard, and ere she had time to reply, he had turned on his heel and walked away. She watched him eagerly as he strode along the gravelled path, but he never once looked behind him. Watched him till he turned a corner behind a clump of trees, and then, with a little sigh, she retraced her steps towards the city. It was much later than usual when she reached Netherby Hall, but she gave no hint of what had detained her. Early in the evening she retired to her room, under the plea of a bad headache, a circumstance that was not uncommon after a day in the great noisy city of Bodleford, so that no one sought to detain her or made any remark, except to express the hope that her headache would be quite gone by morning. Once in her room, she locked the door behind her and gave way to a few quiet tears. She had spoken hopefully enough to Jack, yet in her heart she had serious fears and misgivings as to the future, and the more she thought about the matter, the more despondent she became. To be turned adrift upon the world, homeless and penniless, was bad enough, but to be turned adrift with a blackened reputation was 1,000 times worse, and she could not but fear that Jack would sink under the load that was laid upon him, and drift down the stream to utter ruin. How gladly she would help him if she knew how, but she could see no way of rendering him any assistance. She knew he was very poor, yet to offer him money would only insult him, and widen the gulf perhaps that had come between them. And yet, to let him drift on to destruction without a friendly hand being stretched out to save him seemed the very extreme of cruelty. She regretted now that she had not accepted him as her lover, for then she would have had the right to assist him, and why should he be allowed to sink down into the mire of want and poverty when she had enough for both? It seemed a strange providence, if providence it was, yet she had acted for the best, and had tried to do what was right. She had no doubt now that she loved him. In his poverty and distress he had touched her heart as he had never done in the old days. And if he had spoken to her of his love again that day, poor as he was and disgraced, she would have responded without reserve. He had already displayed the qualities that once he seemed to lack, and given a fair chance in the world, she had no doubt that he would succeed. Hence she was no longer fearing to link her life to his, if he would come and ask her love as he once had done. But he would not come. That she knew very well. She had felt it all the while they had been together that day. He had evidently buried the past, or at least had tried to do so. They would meet henceforth as mere acquaintances, if they met at all. He would never presume, she was sure, upon what had passed between them. Oh, how he had misinterpreted her agitation that day, and dropped her hand as though she had stung him, while all the while her heart was hungering for a word of love. And now he would go away and try to forget her, and imagine perhaps that her regard for him had ceased because his circumstances had changed. How little he knew of her yet, if he imagined that mere social position could influence her to that extent, or that he was less to her because he was poor instead of rich. Oh, she might explain without, she hoped, being thought unmaidenly, but he would not give her the chance, and so they both must suffer in silence, and loving each other with all their hearts, neither would dare to declare that love. She rose from her chair at length, and went to the window and threw it open. It was a lovely summer night, warm and still. Far away down in the valley she could hear the ripple of the Bodle borne faintly on the breeze, and now and then the whir of a bat's wing as it swiftly fluttered past her window. But with these exceptions, no sound broke the stillness. Leaning on her elbow over the window-sill, she gazed dreamily out into the night. Overhead the stars burned brightly, but she did not see them, and around her the wind whispered softly and died away in the distance, but she did not hear. Indeed, she scarcely seemed conscious of anything. Every sense became steeped in a soft, dreamy languor. The weariness of the day was beginning to tell upon her. She had wearied her brain until it refused to think any more. And now tired nature was beginning to yield to the influences of the hour. How long she sat there, gazing out into the night, she never knew. But she started up at length in a fright, and stared wildly about her as a piercing scream rang out into the night and died swiftly away over the hills. It seemed to her as though she recognized the voice, and that it cried, "Ada!" as it went rushing past. "It was Jack's voice," she said with blanched lips. "Something has happened to him." And she listened eagerly for its repetition, but no other sound broke the silence. And closing the window, at length she crept fearfully into bed. For hours she lay, trembling and listening, now persuading herself that the cry she heard was a token, and now chiding herself for her folly in being frightened at the cry of some night bird. The dawn, however, began to creep through the window at length, and then she fell into a gentle sleep, which continued far on into the forenoon. But not until the following day did she quite recover her usual spirits, and was able to put away the superstitious fancy that had so broken her rest. That is the end of chapter 13, and thus the end of our tale today. One of the things that absolutely fascinates me about this book and others of its time is the way in which the social convention is so strong in them. It's not that one really fears the loss of emotion or feeling. It's that there is a great sense in the mind of the characters, and maybe in the mind of the writer as well, that what is proper should be respected above all else. It's something that we don't really have today, or at least I don't experience in my daily life, and I'm not sure that I'm sorry that it's gone. It seems a weight around the neck of social interaction that would be stifling in this modern time. So I'm glad to see that we have allowed ourselves to open up more to others, both in those that we associate with and in the way in which we do so. It's nice that that's the case, for I would hate to think of a world where I could not speak to someone in a coffee shop more than just as a business transaction. If we should land upon a topic of mutual interest, then why not engage on it? It's those moments that make life so wonderful, that human interaction. And I'll leave you with that thought today. But we'll be back soon to continue Real Grit and to see what befalls young Jack Formby in the aftermath of this cruel piece of trickery. I look forward to it, to finding out what happens, and to seeing you again soon. Until then, goodbye.